Well, hello. So here I am, groveling on my knees, prostrating myself in front of this wonderful, fantastic tower of books, all written by women, all non-fiction, all of them been selected for the Women's Prize Non-fiction Longlist 2024. What must it feel like, I wonder, to be on this inaugural list? Anyway, the reason I'm grovelling in front of it is because I've had visitors for the weekend, they've gone, and I need to get cracking on this list because I reckon I've got about 4 weeks to try and break the back of it, and I mean that in the nicest way. So I just thought I'd sit here and contemplate for a moment where to start, and it's really tricky because there are some books on here that I'm immediately thinking, oh, I really want to rush to, but I'm actually going to, for practical reasons, I've got a trip away for a week coming up soon, and so I think I'm going to reserve the paperbacks for that trip. So almost immediately they've kind of been eliminated from the choice. I also don't feel I want to start with one that's really, really short. I feel like I want to start with something that I can really get my teeth into. And I also feel that there are two of these books, and I don't know whether you're the same, but the Shadows at Noon, the South Asian 20th century exploration by Joya Chatterjee, is quite a tome, and I think it's the sort of book that normally I would read over a long period of time and dip into. And I also feel the same possibly about Young Queens, and that's partly just to do with the chunky nature of them, and not sometimes when I'm reading something like that I can get a little bit bogged down and need something to read in between. So I actually think maybe I need to pick two books, and I'm also in the process of trying to choose where I might go, where I might explore next year on my travels. And South Asia might be somewhere that I end up. So I'm kind of thinking that would really be helpful in terms of choosing where to go. So I think actually I'm probably going to choose two. I'm going to choose Shadows at Noon. So I'm going to try and carefully lift this off. Oh, tower is coming down. And I think I'm going to use this as a book that I perhaps spend some time with once or twice a week and dip into. You can see, as I say, it's pretty, it's a tome, and there isn't an awful lot of relief in the sense of pictures or anything like that for a non-fiction text. There are some in the middle. So I feel as though, if I'm going to be honest with myself, that's kind of what I need to do. So it's an ambitious synthesis of decades of research that explores the key strands of a South Asian history, from the British Raj to independence and partition. It looks at India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. It's described as bold, innovative and personal. I really like that. I like the idea that it's told with somebody for whom this history has a real pertinence. So I'm looking forward to starting on that and reporting back on how I'm getting on. And I think it's a really tricky one, this, because there are so many here that I really want to have a go at. But actually, I think the one I'm going to choose next is Matrescence. This was one that I'm hoping. So, oh, sorry, they're quite heavy. It's described, it says on the front, on the metamorphosis of pregnancy, childbirth and motherhood. And it's talking about the changes that happen to a woman when she's pregnant, and presumably and the way it affects your physiology, your psychology, and your social interaction. So I'm hoping, it says it's a deeply personal and groundbreaking investigation into the subject. And it looks at neuroscience, it looks at psychoanalysis, it looks at all sorts of things. So again, I think it's going to be quite good brain food. But what I'm really hoping, I'll get round to it now, is that this is the kind of book that you could hand to a man to read, to sort of try and help them to share that whole experience. Having had 3 children and 2 stepchildren myself, some of the things that happen to you during the process of pregnancy and during the process of being motherhood can be difficult to even understand yourself, let alone explain to somebody else, and somebody else who loves you and has to put up with you. So I'm kind of hoping that this is the kind of book that, for example, I could hand to one of my sons, you know, in order to help them to understand what they're dealing with, perhaps. Yeah, I feel there's a need for that, and I'm excited to see whether this book is that thing. So that's what I'm going to start with. So I just thought I would update you on my reading of Matrescence. I'm about halfway through. Oh my God. I am just so delighted that this book was drawn to my attention through the prize, because there's absolutely no way I don't think that I would have picked it up. And it's really interesting because I'd already decided to read it, and then looking at people's comments on the long list, this book is not being mentioned. People, clearly it's off the radar, and I am romping through it. It's so interesting. As I said earlier, you know, I've had 3 children, and there is so much in here that I had no idea about. So Lucy Jones writes beautifully, by the way. She starts off with a description of slime moulds. Bear with me, because there are various sections through the text where she looks at motherhood and change, transformation in other aspects of the animal and plant kingdom. So there's a section on frogs, tadpoles, there's a section on eels, there's a section on Portuguese men of war, etc., etc. And she's, you know, those sections are beautifully written. It's almost like poetry. And actually, who knew this was the year that I had said I was going to start to learn more about fungi, because I do lots of forest walking and I know a little bit about birds and trees and plants, but nothing about fungi. So I found the whole slime mold thing extra interesting. Yeah, I'm loving that aspect of it. She writes about her own, the sort of whole frame of reference, the whole journey focuses on her own experience of carrying her first child, particularly a daughter, and then she has 2 sons subsequently, who she also mentions where it's relevant, but mainly she's focusing on her first experience of pregnancy and birth. I'm about halfway through and beginning to look at the effects that pregnancy has on the maternal brain, because her whole argument is that we talk about the baby all the time. How's the baby doing? How's the baby doing? But we don't talk about how the mother is doing. So this whole book is exploring what's happening to the mother. Who knew that your brain changes so dramatically when you have a child? I wasn't aware of that. She was talking about looking at some scans of brains of mothers who'd had children, people who'd had children, women who'd had children and women who hadn't. And even just from looking at the scans, you can tell which women have had a baby. These are scans of the brain, by the way. I'm not sure I said that. And which haven't. And that blew my mind. There have been so many things in here that really blow my mind. Who knew that fetal cells actually, from the baby, end up in different parts of the woman's body? You know, some of them end up in the brain, in all sorts of organs and tissues. And actually, I mean, this is a bit freaky, because I've had 3 children, 3 pregnancies, and my first son, Simon, his fetal cells will probably be present in my subsequent daughter and subsequent son. Now, there's a thought. So this book is just, I mean, I feel like I've learned a tremendous amount in a very short space of time. I literally cannot put it down. And it is doing exactly what I hoped it would do. It's explaining. I mean, I'm thinking, you know, this would be a wonderful book for somebody who is pregnant for the first time, or for somebody who's a young mother and thinking, why am I feeling like this? She writes so well about the isolation that motherhood can bring, particularly in contemporary British society. You know, in many ways, we've kind of lost the plot in the way that we look at motherhood, and the huge expectations that motherhood places on women in contemporary Britain, because, you know, you're expected to go out to work, you're expected to juggle all these things, and yet your brain might be turned to mush by your hormones, etc., etc. Actually, I shouldn't have said that, because I've you know, I'm being re-educated, and actually your brain doesn't go to mush. That is a flipping myth. And you can see how entrenched it is in my head, but actually there's lots of evidence that that female brains are actually sharpened and enhanced by the whole process. So I am ashamed of myself now for coming out with that particular bit of nonsense. So yeah, I think this is such an important book for women and men. I can absolutely see why it was selected for the list. I'm outraged that I knew nothing about this book, and I'll get back to you when I've finished it, because hopefully the momentum will be maintained. Morning. Well, I've finished Matrescence. I'm still in my pajamas, can't lie, and it didn't diminish. In fact, if anything, it just got better and better and better. I have thoroughly enjoyed this. I feel like I really want to rave about this book. Just the research that's gone into it, and the thoughtfulness and the humanity behind it. You know, there's one passage where she's talking about the sleep deprivation that young mothers face, and she makes a comparison between, you know, in 2004, the US military was still using sleep deprivation as a way of extracting information from detainees. And even in that situation, they, by law, had to give the detainees at least 4 hours sleep in every 24 hours. And she's making the point that actually there are many, many young mums walking our streets, trying to function at work, who are experiencing that level of sleep deprivation. So it's the way that she manages to really shine a light, using lots of really good analogies and evidence on how difficult and challenging motherhood can be. And there's optimism there too. You know, she really struggled, I think, in the first couple of years of her motherhood, but actually it also brings her tremendous joy, and she doesn't dim that at all. So it's not please don't think that this is a very negative book, because it really, really isn't. I've learned so much about the natural world. I didn't know that lichen was actually not an organism in itself. It's actually a combination of other organisms. Oh, just lots and lots of factual information that is just in itself intrinsically interesting. So thank you, Lucy Jones, because you've explained a lot of quite complicated scientific bits and pieces to me, and I've understood it really well. I'm not assuming Lucy's watching this video, by the way. I'm using direct address because I just really feel very strongly about this novel. I'm a novel, so used to it, you see. Feel really strongly about this wonderful book, and quite evangelical about it. So there we are. So next up on my list is, I think, going to be Naomi Klein's Doppelgänger, which I'm hearing a lot of discussion about online. So I'll be reporting back to you hopefully on that one before too long. Well, back again sooner than I thought. So one of the reasons being, I've forgotten that one of the things I want to do after I've read each book is to sort of judge it against the Women's Prize criteria, which I have written down on these lovely cards here, because I always forget what they are. So I want to measure Matrescence against the criteria. So one of the criteria, these aren't in the right order, is accessibility. and 100% this book I think could be read by pretty much anybody. I felt that she made difficult ideas really, really accessible, so it definitely is a win on that front. Does it have an original narrative voice? Yes, I would argue that it does. I think particularly the combination of the poetic passages and the way that she interleaves academic research and then her own personal history. She's sort of juggling three things at once there, and I think that is probably pretty original, although I'm not an I'm not expert on non-fiction, but I don't remember coming across that before. Next up is excellence in writing, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think this book is absolutely superbly well written. She can inform very clearly, but also she can describe beautifully. And the final one is robust research, and I would certainly say that this book has been very, very well researched. So I think that this book meets all of those criteria equally successfully, actually. There we go. So I am well underway now with my reading of Naomi Klein's Doppelgänger. She calls it a trip into the mirror world. I think oh, sorry, just kicked the camera. I think trip is a bit of a underestimation. It's certainly an adventure. Yeah, so I am really enjoying this. I'm not sure that I thought I would. I love politics. I tend to inhale my politics by listening to the radio and to podcasts. I don't tend to read very much that's political, so I approach this with a little bit of trepidation. And there are a lot of things in here that I'm already aware of, but she has certainly whisked me into a very sort of dark and fascinating and uncomfortable space. So the premise of the book is that Naomi Klein, during lockdown, began to be increasingly concerned that she was being confused for Naomi Wolf. Now, as she explains, she can sort of understand why those confusions might occur. They're both a similar age, they both have similar aspects to their appearance, they both have Jewish heritage, they both have been writing about sort of political and social ideas for many years. So she kind of accepts that maybe occasionally they may be confused in people's minds, and this wasn't so much of a problem originally because Naomi Wolf was a well-known feminist. She published a book in the early 90s on beauty, and the sort of whole relationship between the beauty, the sort of beauty industry, the desire to be beautiful, and feminism. And she was supported by feminists for many years, and then gradually and increasingly, particularly in recent times, has become more associated with the world of conspiracy theory. And of course, that is something that Naomi Klein feels very, very uncomfortable about, because Wolf's reputation has been really undermined. She published a book called Outrages some years ago, and it was proven, I think in a live interview, that she had completely misunderstood some of the research that she was writing about, and the publishers actually withdrew the book from publication. So there are question marks about Naomi Wolf's research, about her understanding of the material that she writes and talks about. And yet, at the same time, she's become increasingly more vocal. During COVID, she was circulating all sorts of myths about vaccination. She was an anti-vaxxer, and again has been proven to have misconstrued a lot of the medical research on the subject. So Naomi Klein, of course, does not want to be associated with that kind of poor research, etc., etc. So it, and I think it particularly struck home as she describes it in the book when somebody's written something online where they clearly are confusing her with Naomi Wolf, and she responds to this man by just sort of gently nudging him that actually, you know, I'm not Naomi Wolf, I'm Naomi Klein. You're referring to the wrong person. And he immediately gets back to her and apologizes, because it becomes apparent that the algorithm has picked up the connection between the two women and had autocorrected to Klein rather than Wolf. And it's at that point that she becomes really deeply concerned about being confused for Naomi Wolf, and starts to refer to her as the other Naomi, obviously her doppelganger. And this sends her on this whole massive investigation about, not just about this idea of kind of having this double who's sort of opposite, but in certain ways not. And that's one of the things that I love about it. She looks at doppelgangers in lots of different forms of literature, particularly exploring a book by Philip Roth, who's not an author that she particularly admires, or whose views she particularly admires, particularly his misogyny. But there's one particular book, and I've forgotten the name of it now, where he's looking at the whole idea of doppelgangers, and she starts to see lots and lots of truth in this story. So I'm loving that. I'm loving the fact that it's not, you know, it's focused on Wolf, but also she brings in all her concerns about Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon was behind Trump's 2016 election campaign, and was his political advisor for the first, well, not quite a year of his administration. So been very close to Trump, but he's also one of these people who, you know, he was an investment banker. He was an executive producer on lots of movies. He, you know, he's one of these people who just seems to have his finger in every sort of pie you can possibly imagine, and is you know, as Naomi Klein reveals, is a very, very shrewd strategist, and she is really intrigued by the fact that Naomi Wolf and Steve Bannon have become more and more and more aligned, and Naomi Wolf constantly appears on his TV programs, etc., etc. So, you know, all of that is really, really interesting. So I've been reading about how about her attitude towards Greta Thunberg's blah 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 speech, because she's beginning to talk about the way that language is being subverted and almost made meaningless by conspiracy theorists, particularly, you know, on the far right, and the sort of irony of them using lots of language that's associated with the Nazi regime, you know, words like Holocaust, genocide, various members of Hitler's cabinet being compared to various, you know, contemporary political figures, and how that kind of is sort of diluting language so that it's not actually doing what it's kind of meant to do, or what we assumed it would do. So this book is certainly bombarding me with lots and lots of very interesting brain food. It's clearly, you know, the research behind it is evident and very thorough. Occasionally, I sort of wonder whether she's pushing the doppelganger theme. You know, I love this whole idea of the mirror world and so on, but I sort of think, is she crowbarring it in? And then I think, no, she's not. It really, you know, it really is. The whole pursuit of this whole doppelganger idea is leading her towards all sorts of really interesting patterns and conclusions. So yeah, so I'm probably over halfway through. So I will report back, of course, when I have completed my reading of this rather amazing, wonderful book. So I have finished reading this wonderful book. My brain is completely like ready to explode. you've got to sort of concentrate to really follow the sophistication of the arguments that she's putting forward, which I think is really important. And she's got so many very, very clever ways of making sure that you do. I found there's a fabulous section in the book where Naomi Klein explores her son's autism and looks at the idea that an autistic child might also might for some parents represent a sort of doppelganger, because it's not quite the child that they thought they were going to have. And so she really looks, I found it fascinating the way that she looks at society's attitude towards autism, and totally what's the word, unmasked, unveiled in front of my eyes the misconceptions I had around the initial research into autism, or a lot of it, and Asperger's in particular. I hadn't known that Asperger himself, a doctor who worked in Vienna on the run-up to the Second World War, had actually started off by being involved in a very kind of what's the word, empathic exploration of autism, and then had become completely sort of overwhelmed by Nazi ideology. And actually, well, maybe I won't say too much more because it's so fascinating. I think you need to go and read it and find out for yourself. It really did expose my ignorance. And there's a brilliant section as well about First Nation Canadians and some of the politics around that. The Kamloops schools, which you may remember being in the press, where Indigenous Canadian children were found to be buried in numerous numbers, particularly at Christian schools, Catholic schools, and that was officially recognised as genocide by the Pope and by the Canadian government some time ago. But what she looks at is the response by a group of truckers, one of whom particularly who felt he'd had his eyes opened by what had happened at these schools, and organised a mass rally of, I think he was aiming for 200 odd trucks but ended up with 400, to drive to the burial site. And they'd produced orange flags and orange t-shirts in memory of these children who died. And then she looks at the way that during COVID, shortly afterwards, a similar rally was organised across Canada by a group of truckers who were opposing COVID-19 measures, which meant that you couldn't cross, they weren't allowed to drive their trucks across into different countries unless they'd been vaccinated. And she looks at how that was kind of hijacked by white supremacists, and she's exploring whether that's a subconscious or conscious echoing of the truck drive that was there to support or to show what's the word, to apologise in effect for what had happened to these children. And the thing I really have admired about this book is that she doesn't really, you can feel her anger, you can feel her frustration, but equally you can feel her empathy. She's trying to really understand what drives people to exploit a situation like that. She feels that probably from their perspective, it's actually self-preservation. We live in a very harsh world. The economics are harsh. We've got, huge issues with the environment. The future's very unstable, so these people are perhaps just responding in their ignorance to a way of sort of preserving what they have. And the tail end of the book, I don't want to go into too much detail in case you read it, but I've come away feeling it's reminded me of how complicit I am as a middle class, educated, professional person, who is aware of a lot of these issues, the issues of climate change, the issues politically, but what am I actually doing about it? And is the fact that I recycle my bottles, and I don't know, I'm reasonably careful about where I shop. Is that a way of just covering up the problem? Am I actually just as culpable as anyone else? So I'd recommend this read to anyone. I feel a lot wiser for it. It's a bit like, not quite like reading a Greek tragedy, in the sense that it's sort of catharsis but sort of not. But it's really made me think hard about the world that I live in 2024. So I won't forget this time with this book. I've got my cards ready here. How does Naomi Klein's Doppelgänger in my little brain match up to the criteria for the Women's Prize? So the first one I picked up here is accessibility. Now this is where I'm really conflicted, because I think I'm quite a bright woman, and there were sections of this that I had to reread. Now I don't know whether that's because I'm not used to reading so much about politics. I'm not totally convinced that this book is accessible to anyone. But having said that, I think that Naomi Klein has probably made the subject matter as accessible as it possibly can be. I don't think it's a flaw in her writing. I think it's the fact that she's taking on such a deep and very controversial and very difficult subject. So I don't really quite know how to rate that. So that's one for me to ponder, I think. Is there original narrative voice here? I think that by the end of this book, I feel like I know her. And she doesn't really talk an awful lot about her personal life. I know I've made some references to it, but there's very little about her and her family. It's just there sort of on the periphery. But I come away feeling like I know her, and certainly understanding her voice. So I think from that perspective, it is original. I haven't read any of her other books, and I suspect they're probably similar in that regard. Does it represent excellence in writing? Absolutely it does. You know, this is a wonderful, entertaining, intense, emotive read. So yes. Does it represent robust research? My goodness. I don't think anybody could contradict that. I don't quite know how long it took her to write this book, but I should, because it feels so current. But I should imagine that there was a tremendous years of research that went behind the production of this. And, you know, she actually does discuss that process as well. So you get a sense of just how thoroughly she fact checks and how important she feels it is to be truthful, in inverted commas, about what she's producing. So yeah, there we go. What a start to my Women's Prize for Non-fiction Longlist journey. That's 2 books I've thoroughly enjoyed, 2 books that I can't lie, I probably would not have got to. So yeah, I need to go over to my shelves or to my lovely pile. I've started to create a pile of the ones I've read on my little table here. So that's hopefully going to grow quite significantly over the next few days. We shall see. Take care, everyone. Happy reading. Please post down below if you've read either of these books, what you thought of them. I'd be really, really interested to hear. Take care, everybody. Bye.